Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, PhD, for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. There was a decision that came down from the World Court at The Hague relative to the case that was brought by South Africa. South Africa, of course, has a long history of oppressing Black people during the years of apartheid. They have passed those years, and as a result, South Africa has become extremely sensitive to cases which involve human rights and cases of genocide. Now, South Africa itself did not exactly commit genocide per se, but certainly their activities involved relocation, um, prohibiting people from going into certain areas, uh, creating kind of sub-nations within South Africa for Black people in South Africa. And if you were in one of those sub-nations, that's where you had to stay, unless you had special permission to go someplace else. So now that South Africa is no longer an apartheid state, it is one of the leading advocates in the world for human rights. And I think that's very good because I remember the years of apartheid very well. I lived through them and they were very disheartening to me. And I was very upset, especially I remember when I was traveling to Congo, then called Zaire, on Swiss Air. The plane I was on, although landing in Kinshasa, if I would have stayed on that plane, which I couldn't have because I didn't have a ticket, but theoretically, I guess I could have stayed on the plane. If I would have stayed on the plane, the next stop for the plane was Johannesburg, South Africa. So I was literally disgusted. As I was walking off the plane, I remember looking at the faces of the people who were staying on the plane, and I just felt nothing but sorrow and nothing but disenchantment at seeing that people were actually willing to go to South Africa. Perhaps I was being judgmental. It's not good to be judgmental. I have no right to judge anybody else as an individual, but I do have a right to condemn nations. And I did condemn South Africa, much as I now praise it for bringing that case against Israel for what it has been doing in Gaza. Now, I was somewhat disappointed again that the decision was not more strong than it was. There was no statement in the decision which called for an immediate ceasefire. However, the decision did refer to the activities of Israel in Gaza as genocide. So I think that is the most significant part of what took place at the World Court in The Hague, referring to the acts of Israel as genocide. If that does not put Israel on a much lower standing in the world community, I don't know what will. Already, many countries have condemned both the United States and Israel. The United States for being the primary supporter of Israel, both in money and in arms, and Israel, of course, for carrying it out. One can, in a way, think of the war against Gaza as a war fought by not only Israel, but as a war fought by the United States. The United States has blood on its hands as well, not only Israel. Now, what will likely be Israel's response? I think we already know that based upon some of the comments that have been made by Israeli officials. Israel will most likely ignore the decision of the World Court, in spite of the fact that Israel did not ignore the World Court. It actually went to The Hague and participated in the tribunal and gave its own testimony, made its arguments for why the war in Gaza is justified by its own weird logic, but still it lost. And if you lose something, especially if you were a part of it, you would think that the people who lost would say, okay, we lost. Now, what do we do? Can we appeal it? As far as I know, and maybe I'm wrong, there is no appeal mechanism in the World Court. But by the same token, the World Court has no enforcement mechanism. The World Court has no army. The World Court has no Navy or Marines or Air Force. There is nothing really that the World Court itself can do except to issue condemnations, as it has many times. And so it's sad that the World Court cannot stop Israel from doing what it is doing. It has no means of doing so. Israel can keep on attacking Gaza with impunity. So here's what's been happening in the hours since the decision was made. Many people have been calling for a resurrection of the BDS movement. BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Basically trying to encourage countries to boycott Israel, to divest from any kind of investments that it might have in Israel, and to impose sanctions on Israel. That's BDS. But BDS has not been successful. Boycotts in general are rarely successful. I talked earlier about the one that I was involved in that involved Cesar Chavez and the Mexican migrant workers, which was a complete failure. Nothing came of it. In fact, now the situation for the Mexican migrant workers is worse than it was back in the late 1960s when I was involved in the boycott efforts, when I was involved in trying to get people to sign the boycott form, which most people would not do. Even my own parents would not do it. They were afraid of ending up on some list. That was their justification, but that's off topic. Main thing is, which I think we should take some heart in, is that the World Court has imposed at least a decision that Israel is engaging in genocide. That is a really harsh decision. And certainly the nations of the world, whether they support Israel or not, cannot fail to take notice. Even President Biden, whose approval rating among Democrats has gone into the cellar, cannot fail to take notice. His chances of being reelected while not impossible, are now relatively low. But by the same token, the chances of President Trump, former President Trump, of being reelected are also relatively low. So there really is no way of knowing who will be elected as the next president of the United States, because we have a loser running against another loser. I think that President Biden thought that by supporting Israel, not only would he be doing the right thing, but he would be doing the politically accurate thing, meaning that people would support him for supporting Israel, even people in his own party, the Democratic Party. In fact, precisely the opposite has happened. And yet, despite that, President Biden has continued supporting Benjamin, aka Bibi, Netanyahu, and the Israeli government in its war against Gaza. So I don't know what is going to happen. Neither do you. Neither does anybody. Maybe Netanyahu has some idea. Ultimately, the decision rests with him and rests with his government. Presumably, his government could withdraw support from Netanyahu. The government itself would collapse, which would demand the election of a new government and a new prime minister. But that, I think, is very, very unlikely, because Netanyahu's coalition consists largely of parties that are to the right of Netanyahu's own Likud party. And if Netanyahu backs down from the war against Gaza, now perhaps he would say against Hamas, but really it's a war against Gaza, then it is likely that his support among people in Israel would go away. And Netanyahu does not want that to happen for a number of reasons. One, I guess, because he believes that the war is justified, I assume, or at least he has no moral compass to tell him otherwise. And secondly, because as soon as the war ends, and as soon as Netanyahu is no longer prime minister in Israel, it is likely that war crimes trials will begin against him. So there is really no incentive for Netanyahu to end the war, in spite of the decision by the World Court, and every incentive for him to continue it. So am I optimistic that this decision will make any real change on the ground? No. And I don't think anybody should be. Now, I think it would be nice if the World Court had an army, but that's a problem with the entire United Nations and all of its bodies, including the World Court. It has very little enforcement capabilities. It can condemn, but it really can't enforce that much. So whatever Israel does, it can say, we don't like the fact that you're doing this, stop it. But can the UN actually take steps to enforce what it says? For the most part, no. For the most part, no. And so as a world, we are really caught in a quagmire right now. We are really, really caught in a quagmire. We are living in some really, really bad times. The times of the ultimate contradiction of capitalism imperialism, perhaps rising to its highest level ever. Maybe not, but that's my sense. At least in my lifetime, I can't think of a time when the imperialism of the empire, of the American empire, which includes Israel, has been this strong and this resistant to the efforts by other nations to end a war or to end any kind of hostilities or to engage in any behavior. Both Netanyahu and Biden seem impervious to the community of nations. They simply don't care, it would appear. Now, I suppose we will have to see. This is early in the process. President Biden knows that his numbers have gone into the cellar. He's not a stupid man. I would call him an evil man, but he is certainly not stupid. He is nobody's fool. And I assume that President Biden would like to be reelected this November. And the chances of that happening keep on dwindling. Now, he could still be reelected because of the person he is running against, but still, I mean, you would think that under ordinary circumstances, that President Biden running against President Trump, I mean, you would think that would be an automatic victory, given the presidency of Trump, given the fact that President Trump was impeached twice, although he was convicted neither time. But now, that does not seem so sure. So this year, 2024, that we have just recently entered, is going to be a very, very stressful year, I think. A lot of things will happen, not only the political campaigns, not only the primaries, not only the election, but also the war in Gaza. The war supposedly against Hamas, but which is really not entirely against Hamas, which is really against Gaza, because Israel wants the lands, I guess. Israel wants the land. Israel wants Gaza. It really wants Gaza. And it is willing to face the reality of becoming a pariah in the international community in order to attain its objectives. Bibi Netanyahu could care less, in my opinion, about what the international community thinks about him. He could care less about what Joe Biden thinks about him. That's clear in statements he's made. So Netanyahu will do whatever Netanyahu thinks is in his own political interests, and nothing more and nothing less. That's it. And I don't expect that to change. So again, I am hoping for some change. I don't like seeing so many people, including babies and incubators, being killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. I don't like seeing young girls raped by the Israeli Defense Forces, both of which have happened. I want this to end as soon as it possibly can end. And I really wish that the World Court would have called for a ceasefire, but they stopped short of doing that. For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, PhD. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.